Hello, welcome to the New Stack Makers, a podcast where we talk about at-scale application development, deployment, and management. We'd like to thank Capital One, our sponsor for the podcast from OSCON in Austin, Texas. Learn more about Capital One's developer program at developer.capitalone.com. Hey, it's Alex Williams of the New Stack here from OSCON in Austin, Texas with Jon Bodner of Capital One. This is the first interview here at the conference. Thanks for joining us, Jon.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Great. And I wanted to talk with you a little bit about what you're discussing today in your presentation at OSCON. Can you tell us what the topic is and what you'll be discussing?
Sure, absolutely. So I'll be talking about open sourcing a project that we've done at Capital One. It actually began as a fork of an existing open source project that we took in-house and added some improvements to. And then when trying to contribute those changes back to the original project, and they were actually okay with not taking the changes back, and then the process of building up a community inside of Capital One and then reopen sourcing it as a Capital One project.
So it's a fork of an existing project. What is the project?
It's called LGTM. It's by Brad Rzuski, who wrote drone.io. And it's a GitHub pull request approval system. And so before GitHub had anything built in to do this, Brad had built a very simple system that would let you specify a list of approvers and a number of approvers to approve a pull request and a magic keyword to look for. And if those things all happened, then the pull request could be merged. And this was a good start, and we had a couple more features we wanted to add into it that would automate more of the process because we wanted to look for tools to automate our development, delivery, deployment process. So we started making modifications to it and tried contributing back our modifications. And turned out in the end that Brad was actually pretty happy with the state of LGTM as it was. He wasn't looking for more features for it. And so he gave us his blessing really to make our own fork.
Okay, so I'm curious about that process overall. So, it's based on LGTM, and it's based on what Brad did with drone.io.
Yeah.
And it basically kind of is designed kind of to help automate, pull requests, isn't it?
Correct. So that you're able to, when you have pull requests, you want to make sure there's been some sort of code review that somebody's actually checked to make sure that you're merging in something that's been validated. And oftentimes people just see pull requests, they merge it, they're done. But you don't really know who's doing that merging. Could be the same person who did the pull request in the first place. And at bigger places like Capital One, you want to have some sort of control over the process. And depending on where you're deploying to, whether it's a dev deployment or a QA deployment or a production deployment, different people want to approve it. And so the original project of LGTM didn't do all of these things. We had to add in functionality to make that support available for corporations and other companies that have more complicated approval processes.
So how have you been using LGTM then at Capital One?
So there's about 500 projects right now that are using our fork, which we have codenamed LGT Meow.
LGTM Meow?
LGT Meow.
Like a cat?
Like a cat. We have the little emoji instead of an M. It's very cute. But that name's not going to last long term. It'll be a different name when it actually goes public.
Okay.
That's unfortunate.
Meow.
Yeah,
I like it though.
We do too. We're very fond of it. So there's Cloud Custodian, one of our other open source projects, uses LGT Meow to make sure that when they have new approval rules that they've been reviewed by somebody else. We have we eat our own dog food. LGT Meow approves LGT Meow builds. And so it automatically deploys our code to our dev environment or our stage environment, and with different kinds of approvals necessary to make sure these things actually happen.
Okay, so tell me then about how you work internally to create that to create that fork. What is the decision making you went through to decide to make that to work with Brad, and once maybe that is a start. Like, how did you approach Brad? Like, what did you initially do?
Well, actually, we didn't have to approach him because we knew about his project. And he released it on GitHub as an open source project.
Right.
So we just forked it from there. and brought it internally.
But you had his blessing, you said.
But when we tried to contribute it back, after we went through a process internally, we'd made our changes, went through the open source contribution process at Capital One, and tried pushing our fork back into his project. He looked at the pull request and said, first said, no, this is too big. So we broke it up. And he said, no, actually, I don't really want these features added in. And so I talked with him a little bit later to make sure, said, we want to open source this as our own work. And he said, that's perfectly fine. He understands that he didn't have, it was not a project that he didn't feel threatened by us open sourcing it ourselves. And that was what I wanted to avoid, make sure that we weren't going to fracture a community or make someone feel bad or add bad blood to an open source process that already existed. It was Capital One wants to be a member of these communities, not come in there and run roughshod over them.
So when you went through that process internally, tell us a little bit about that. Like, how, decisions decisions are made, right? But there's a process always associated with those decisions.
Yes, absolutely. So what we had done, me and one of my coworkers have been the main developers, Michael Spiegel, who's done probably more of the coding now than I have. We add the features in, we talk to other groups inside of Capital One, and we gather their feature requests as well. And so we have our own GitHub repo that's private inside of Capital One, and people file issues with it. We have a Slack channel that people, again, ask us questions on and suggest features again. We talk with the community around it. We've written blog posts to describe it on our internal blog system. And we built this nice little community actually inside of Capital One of people who had ideas and wanted to do this kind of approval process and saw the value in it. So it was like building an open source community, only all inside of Capital One. And this is sometimes called inner sourcing. Yeah. And Capital One's a huge company. We've thousands of engineers, and they're spread out across multiple places. So really, it feels a lot like having that distributed environment where you're doing open source development.
So what was the trigger then that led to the fork then internally?
Well, we wanted to add our features in because we saw it had initially. And
feature-oriented. So there was enough consensus.
Right. So we saw that we wanted to be able to do things like, for example, one of the things that LGTM didn't do is once you had the approvals in place, it waited for a person to press the button.
Right.
And we said, well, why not have it just press the button itself automatically?
Right.
Simple things like that.
Is that the meow?
That's the meow.
Okay, great.
And so we do things like versioning. So you want to sit there and when you want to create a tag automatically, when I've merged it, now I want to version it also so I know exactly what I'm talking about when I do a release and add that automatically. And then you want to integrate more tightly with GitHub so that instead of specifying your approvers in a file in your project, take advantage of GitHub's built-in support for groups and let those be your rules let those define who can approve a project. And then we said, well, Capital One's approval rules are really kind of complicated sometimes. And so let's design a little tiny language to describe what approvals look like. And let that be specified. So a little Boolean logic to describe this group must approve with this many people, or this group and this group, and specify it per branch or per path inside of a branch, actually. So, and the complication really is we add these features in, but still want to keep it simple to use,
right?
And not make it complicated for people who want to just do something very simple. Should still have very simple configurations, but if you want to get more complicated, we have the ability to be more complicated, but still simple for people doing simple things.
Okay. And so you have a very large organization, thousands of engineers. You've decided to do this fork. And so then you need to organize how you approach that fork by thinking through the different communities inside the organization.
That's correct. And Capital One has a process for open sourcing your code. We're regulated, we're very big, we're public, so we have to make sure we do things the right way when releasing open source. And there's an open source office that is in charge of looking at these things. And so we've gone through their process twice now. Once for the contribution back when we first tried to contribute it just back into the LGTM project. And now a second time as an external project that'll be hosted by Capital One on our public GitHub repository. And the process is mostly similar, but for the external project, for making it our own, part of the process is justifying that it's worthwhile for Capital One to have its name behind this. And having built that community up and talking to all these different groups inside of Capital One showed its value.
Okay. So I'm really interested in like the Boolean logic then, is this a standard thing that you'll do?
It's a very, well, I like DSLs. If you have a problem to describe, there's a custom language that describes it better than a general language.
Right.
I've compared it to like musical notation versus describing playing the piano with words.
Right.
So it's the same idea. If I'm describing approvals, I'm going to want to do things like this group, one person from this group, but not the person who wrote the pull request, or a person from this group, and not the author of the pull request. So very simple language, a couple of functions that are built in, so that way it's a nice, concise way to describe things. And we think it's worked out pretty well for a way to do this.
I'd say it is. And that, it brings me to kind of these questions about then the automation of it. And you really need it to be automated, don't you?
Absolutely. And part of what we're doing is tying into other CI/CD platforms. So part of what ends up happening is the act of doing that merge triggers Circle CI for us to actually start a build process. And Circle CI uses that version tag that we put in as part of our automatic merging to then know how to label things and generate a Docker container and talk to AWS and push out a release for us, or our internal process. The act of doing a pull request approval, just typing LGTM, triggers a deployment.
How are you mapping that out? How are you because there's a workflow there, but there's multiple workflows that are needed to be considered.
Right, and we have a couple of processes inside of Capital One that we're experimenting with to make this more smooth. So it ends up being a little bit fragmented, I will be honest, that GitHub is in charge of certain parts of it, and other systems are in charge of other parts of the approval process. And we're trying to unify this and get back to a single interface, and that's going to require more conversation inside of Capital One and to figure out what process makes the most sense for the most teams, so we get down to as few interfaces as possible to describe the process of developing software and releasing software and managing software.
Okay, so you now have to think about Circle CI. So tell us about the considerations that you're going through. Like, what are those considerations that you're thinking about to define, that continuous integration, that continuous delivery?
Sure. Well, we want to have things as automated as possible. You want to make sure
So
that...
when you're thinking about that automation, tell us about that then,
So you end up starting small and simple. What I've done along the way is build up the shell scripts to describe the process and have them triggered. One of the nice things with using Circle is just running bash scripts for you. And so the same process that you run locally to just figure it out for yourself, you then just take those same script files and just tell Circle to run them instead. And as a starting point, it's kind of a nice place to begin. And so really simple things, using sed to build a task definition JSON to supply to AWS rather than using a full-blown scripting language or templating language, just because it's just enough to get process going. And then once you understand the process you want to do, then you're able to then actually formalize it and talk to teams about finding a more standard way to solve the problem. But if you try to go to the end step first and try to figure out the complete end-to-end solution, you never get there. You have to start small and start with these small pieces. And working with shell scripts, working with Unix kind of concepts of small, sharp tools really helps you get there.
A small, sharp tool approach, right? So then you're developing these. So it's really iterative. You're really trying to see then where the path leads you.
Exactly. We don't want to do too much. Don't try to overthink it. And same thing. We add features. It's the same way. We don't try to guess. We do some guessing what we think users will want, but we talk to them first and don't try to boil the ocean. Don't try to build everything out. Build enough and get feedback and iterate.
So how are you then reaching out? What are the approaches to reaching out?
So inside the company, so I'm on a group called the Tech Fellows at Capital One, and our job is to go to teams inside of Capital One and expose them to different technologies and different approaches, as well as come to conferences and speak and work on open source. And so other Tech Fellows took LGTM to their projects as well. We used it in our projects. People we talked to who were familiar with LGTM and said, oh, that's actually interesting. And some people actually stood up their own forks, their own copies of LGTM inside of Capital One. But when our fork came along and said, oh, this has more features, we'd like to actually switch to your fork and not maintain it ourselves. And so it's this organic growth, really just try it out and talk to people about it. There was no top-down mandate to use this tool. It was people trying it out themselves and learning.
Right. And so then so once you start building those, you're building through that iterative process. Then you're talking to the community. You're then finding kind of those patterns, and then you build upon those patterns.
Exactly.
And so, what patterns have you been building upon then that takes you to where you are now?
Sure. Let me try to think of some examples. So we approval processes and just talk to different teams. Like, what does it mean to approve something for your team? And so we'll talk with those teams, get their feedback about it. And it's kind of interesting what you actually learn along the way. We always thought of pull requests, for example, as a thing to be merged in. And one team told us, no, actually, people in our team will create pull requests and mark it as work in progress and say, never merge this in. This just gets some feedback on something we're trying out. And we're like, oh, that's kind of interesting. So we went through and said, okay, let's build a feature now that if you optionally specify this string appears, this regular expression appears in a pull request name, don't try to merge this, just let it be. And so it's this learning process that people see what you've done and you get their feedback and you then try to figure out how the pieces fit together and not make it a small possible change. Everything layers together nicely and builds together nicely.
So there's two topics I want to address before we talk about where this is all going.
Yeah.
The gaps that you've seen, and how do you approach filling those gaps? Like, can you talk to that? So you're developing this iterative process, right? You've got your fork, right? Meow is doing what it's supposed to do in your initial thoughts, right? Now you're getting into the community, getting the feedback, right? And you're taking that feedback and you're building in new features. Along the way, you always come up against gaps that you see. What are some of the gaps that you are starting to see emerge that you would not have known previously?
That's a good question. So one of the things we had actually done is did a very early version of semantic versioning built into the application, built into our approval process. When we tag it, instead of just a timestamp, we can actually do versions with a major, minor, and patch and follow semantic versioning rules. And it worked okay at first, but then as we realized it, actually as we're dogfooding our own application, we're realizing that our implementation of semantic versioning isn't actually 100%. That there's some places where it gets confusing, you have to start stepping in with more manual work to make it all fit together correctly. And now I have to dive back and try to make our semantic versioning smarter than it was before. And I started sketching out what those rules look like, and it gets kind of complicated, so I've got to get back to it, but it's not quite done yet. Other teams have come up with ideas for features they want to add in, and they're like, oh, well, let's think about this feature being added in. We added in the ability to integrate with Slack, so that you can get a notification in Slack that your pull request is in a certain state, and get back. And it's a small feature to start it out, and some people like it. Someone asks, can we get a link back to the pull request inside of that Slack message? It's like, oh, I guess that would be useful. Just some more learning as you go along. How are people really going to use this tool as you start building it out? And so they show us the gaps in our thinking as they start using it.
Okay, now you go through this process. You've learned where some of the gaps are. How do you capture that knowledge for the next fork that you do?
Well, hopefully there's no more forks. Hopefully it's just
for other there may be.
Yeah.
Well, okay.
Yeah.
Hopefully there are no others. Maybe them for future kind of open source projects that you're working on too.
I think we're hopefully establishing a pattern in Capital One. We're not the first project to be open source.
Right.
Our project is not officially open source yet by
Right.
Capital One. We're still working on it.
Right.
But just the pattern of how you build a community inside of Capital One, and how you get users interested in a project, and how you get feedback and use GitHub as a place to gather pull requests and issues filed, and use our chat system to gather back our communication. So you have this constant communication back and forth with your users. And make it clear there are no dumb questions, that people want to use this thing in the way they want to use it, and they have a reason why they do things the way they want to do things. And if you're going to be providing them a solution to them, you have to understand their problems. And hopefully we've learned that building LGTM, and other teams that want to build their own projects that will be either inner-sourced only or both inner-sourced and open-sourced can use that pattern for their projects as well.
If I don't ask this question, I'm going to just kick myself later. Why is it LGTM meow? Why meow?
Have you ever seen the movie Super Troopers?
No. No.
Oh, there's a part of the movie where they play the meow game. And these state troopers who are very bored pull over someone, and the guy tries to say the word meow 10 times during the conversation, slipping it in. And that inspired us to pick a name.
Well, Super Troopers is going to be on my Netflix list.
It's not safe for work, so if you find it, watch it at home.
Okay, great. So now as far as the trade-offs go, right? There was an initial trade-off you had to decide, like, okay, well, do we just kind of like live with this, or do we go with LGTM meow? You went with LGTM meow.
Right.
What have been the trade-offs of this approach? What are some of the things you look at where you had to say, yeah, we're going to be making a trade-off here if we do this?
Well, we have to maintain it. So we've been running our own servers to do this, and we carry the pagers metaphorically. We carry our cell phones that get text messages when a server dies or when something isn't working correctly. So at Capital One, this is not a common pattern for a developer to be in charge of something that's been deployed. And I actually enjoy it. I think it's actually the right feedback loops. A developer's less inclined to make bugs if they're the one who has to solve the bug when something goes wrong at 3 in the morning.
There you go.
So I'm a big fan of that approach, and maybe we can teach other people at Capital One that this is actually a very healthy approach to software, but it's an unusual approach there. And we are actually working with teams now to take over management of the software from us.
You did say that you hope you never have to do this again. Is this, I mean, a fork is a fork, right? And people there's always kind of a second thought that people go through when they are thinking about a fork?
Well, I hope no one forks us again. I hope that we're able to actually contribute this back and be responsive to people in the community, that when this becomes public, people look at LGT Meow or whatever we call LGT Meow when it's released and say, that has the features I want, and if it doesn't have the features that people want, we can actually respond quickly and actually provide them with those features so that it becomes a process. Other projects in the future, different things, again, hopefully the open source community actually has a process for us to go through that will work out well for us. And forking is really a last resort because you're taking a lot of responsibility for yourself.
Exactly.
And it's best for everyone to stay together as much as possible. Just process happens better.
So where do you go from here with this project?
So we've been in this open source external project pipeline for a while. We've got most of our approvals in place, and we learned a lot about software licenses and having to get things finished. And we're actually dealing with naming. And we're trying to get, so naming matters a lot more than you might think at a big company because it's a big company. You want to make sure the name represents what you actually have. So we've been LGT Meow is very close to being approved, except that someone actually has a trademark on LGTM in the software domain. And so our lawyers said that's too close for comfort using LGT Meow. So we had to go back to the drawing board, and we've been suggesting names for a while now, and branding has not liked our taste in names, apparently. So, looks good to goat, mother may I, repository eyeballs. We're really trying lots of things. And we're hoping we can talk with branding a little bit more and get that naming finished so that we get trademark approval and then we can release it. So that's where we are right now.
What is the license that this will be under?
It's Apache 2. So the original project was Apache 2, and when Capital One does open source projects, we open source under Apache 2 also. So it was very easy for us to justify the process.
Well, Jon, thank you so much for taking some time. This has been really interesting to me. I appreciate your insights and perspectives here.
Well, thanks so much for having me.
Thanks. We'd like to thank Capital One, our sponsor for the podcast from OSCON in Austin, Texas. Learn more about Capital One's developer program at developer.capitalone.com. Listen to more episodes of the New Stack Bakers at thenewstack.io/podcast. Please rate and review us on iTunes, like us on YouTube, and follow us on SoundCloud. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.